September 11, 1967. 20 kilometers northwest of Hanoi, North Vietnam. The wreckage lay twisted in a rice paddy, steam rising from scorched metal as North Vietnamese troops approached cautiously, rifles trained on the shattered cockpit. The monsoon rains had turned the crash site into a sea of mud and debris, the heavy tropical air thick with the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel. Above, the thunder of jet engines faded into the distance as the rest of the strike package disappeared south, leaving their fallen comrade behind enemy lines. The aircraft, what remained of it, was massive even in death. Its delta wings stretched across the flooded field like a fallen monument, heat still radiating from hydraulic lines that leaked precious fluid into Vietnamese soil. Fragments of aluminum skin, painted in the tactical camouflage of jungle green and tan, were scattered across 100 meters of paddy. This was an F-105 Thunderchief. The Americans called it the Thud, a nickname born from the sound it made when it hit the ground, though those who flew it knew better. It was the sound of power, the sound of inevitability, the sound of a machine built not to dance through the sky, but to punch through it with the force of a clenched fist. And now, for the first time, the enemy would get to look inside. Within hours, the wreckage was cordoned off. Soviet advisors stationed in Hanoi received word of the capture before the metal had even cooled. They arrived by truck convoy the next morning, carrying cameras, measurement tools, and a profound curiosity about the aircraft that had been tearing through their defensive networks for over 2 years. What they found would challenge everything they thought they knew about American aviation. What they would reluctantly admit, in classified reports that wouldn't see daylight for decades, would reshape Soviet aircraft design for a generation. The story of the F-105 begins not in the skies over Vietnam, but in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. In the 1950s, as the world adjusted to the terrible arithmetic of nuclear warfare, the United States Air Force faced a singular problem. How do you deliver an atomic weapon deep into enemy territory when Soviet air defenses are designed specifically to stop you? The answer couldn't be a lumbering bomber like the B-29s that had ended World War II. Those flew too high, too slow, too predictable. The Soviets had radar now. They had interceptors. They had missiles that could reach altitudes bombers couldn't escape from. No, the mission required something entirely new. It needed to be fast, supersonic fast. It needed to fly low under radar coverage, then punch through to the target at speeds that made interception nearly impossible. It needed to be survivable enough to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. And it needed to carry a payload heavy enough to level a city. These weren't just ambitious requirements. They were borderline contradictory. Speed required sleek design. Payload required bulk. Survivability required armor and redundancy. You couldn't have all three. Except, somehow you had to. Republic Aviation, the company that had built the legendary P-47 Thunderbolt of World War II, took on the challenge. Their chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, was a Georgian immigrant who'd cut his teeth designing fighters in the 1930s. He understood something fundamental about American aviation. When in doubt, build it bigger and put a bigger engine on it. The P-47 had been the heaviest fighter of World War II, and pilots had loved it precisely because it was tough, survivable, able to take punishment and keep flying. Kartveli wanted to apply that same philosophy to the nuclear age. His engineers envisioned something unprecedented, a fighter bomber that weighed as much as a medium bomber but could outrun interceptors. The resulting design was almost absurd in its ambition. The F-105 would tip the scales at over 50,000 pounds when fully loaded, heavier than many transport aircraft, heavier than the B-17 Flying Fortresses that had bombed Germany. Its fuselage was thick and bulbous, designed around an internal weapons bay that could swallow a nuclear bomb hole. The shape earned it another nickname among test pilots, the Ultra Hog. It looked pregnant, ungainly, like someone had inflated a normal fighter to twice its proper size. But that bulk served a purpose. A single Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine, the most powerful in American service, was buried in the tail, capable of pushing the massive airframe past Mach 2 in level flight. The wings, swept at 45 degrees, were thin and sharp despite the aircraft's overall bulk, optimized for supersonic penetration rather than dogfighting maneuverability. The landing gear was reinforced to handle the tremendous weight, the tires specially designed to withstand the heat of high-speed landings. When the first prototype rolled out in 1955, critics called it ungainly. Aviation journals questioned whether something so large could truly be called a fighter. Test pilots joked that flying it was like strapping yourself to a fuel tank with wings. The first test flight nearly ended in disaster when the prototype's engine exploded on takeoff. Alexander Kartveli reportedly stood on the tarmac, watching smoke pour from his creation, and said simply, "Make the engine stronger." But Republic's engineers understood something fundamental about survival in modern warfare. Speed and payload weren't enough. You needed redundancy. You needed armor. You needed systems that could take punishment and keep functioning when everything around you was trying to kill you. The nuclear mission demanded it. You were flying into the heart of Soviet air defenses, where every radar, every missile, every interceptor would be focused on stopping you. You wouldn't dodge everything, so you had to survive what hit you. The Thunderchief bristled with innovations that pushed the boundaries of 1950s engineering. Its hydraulic flight control system wasn't just doubled, it was tripled, with 3 completely independent circuits running through the airframe. Each system was routed through different sections of the fuselage, separated by structural bulkheads and armor. If one was shot out, the second took over automatically. If the second failed, the third kept you in the air. The pilot never had to touch a switch. The aircraft managed its own survival. The cockpit sat in a bathtub of titanium armor, thick plates welded together to create a protective shell around the pilot. The bottom was especially reinforced, 3/4-inch titanium capable of stopping 23mm cannon rounds fired from directly below. The sides had additional armor, the canopy was reinforced, even the headrest had protection. Republic had studied every F-86 and F-84 loss in Korea, documented where pilots were being killed, and designed the F-105's cockpit to shield against every common threat vector. Every critical system was shielded, protected, reinforced. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, using rubber bladders that would automatically close around bullet holes. The engine had redundant ignition systems. The electrical system had multiple generators. The flight controls had mechanical backups for the hydraulic backups. The aircraft was built on the assumption that it would be hit. The question wasn't if, but how many times it could survive being hit before something vital finally gave out. The internal weapons bay was another innovation. Most fighters carried bombs on external pylons, which created drag and limited speed. The F-105's nuclear bombs sat inside the fuselage, keeping the aircraft's profile clean for supersonic penetration. But the engineers added something clever. The bay was modular, with standardized mounting points that could accept different payloads. Nuclear bombs, sure, but also fuel tanks for extended range, or conventional bombs, or electronic warfare equipment. The same airframe could be configured for different missions in hours rather than days. By 1964, the F-105 had found its calling, though not the one it was designed for. The nuclear mission had given way to something far more brutal and far less abstract: conventional bombing in the dense air defense network of North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained air campaign against the North, became the Thunderchief's crucible. Pilots who had trained for high-altitude nuclear strikes, who had practiced releasing a single city-killing weapon over empty test ranges, found themselves screaming through mountain valleys at 500 feet, dodging tracer fire and surface-to-air missiles in aircraft loaded not with atomic weapons but with thousands of pounds of iron bombs. The missions were savage from the beginning. Strike packages of F-105s would thunder north from bases in Thailand, Korat, Tokli, Udorn, flying in tight formations called flights of 4 aircraft each. A typical mission might have 16 thuds, each loaded with 6 750-pound bombs, escorted by F-4 Phantoms and supported by tankers, rescue helicopters, and electronic warfare aircraft. They would cross into North Vietnam at dawn, when the light was good for bombing but the defenders were still waking up. But by 1967, the defenders never slept. North Vietnam, with massive Soviet support, had transformed the approaches to Hanoi into a killing field of technology and fury. Radar-guided SA-2 missiles, sophisticated enough to track supersonic targets, ringed every important target. The missiles themselves were terrifying, 35 feet long, telephone poles filled with explosives and guidance systems, capable of reaching 60,000 feet and traveling at Mach 3. They left white contrails across the sky as they climbed, visible for miles, giving pilots just seconds to react. But the missiles were only part of the threat. Radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery filled the lower altitudes with a curtain of explosions. The North Vietnamese and Soviets had studied German air defense tactics from World War II and perfected them. They created box barrages, predetermined areas of sky where they fired thousands of shells regardless of whether they saw an aircraft, knowing that anything flying through that space would be hit. The pilots called it flak, and at its worst it looked like a black thundercloud, a roiling mass of explosions that you had to fly through to reach your target. And then there were the MiGs. Soviet-built MiG-17s and MiG-21s, flown by North Vietnamese pilots who were getting better with each passing month, guided by Soviet ground controllers who could see the American formations on radar long before visual contact. The MiGs were faster than the bomb-laden F-105s, more maneuverable, designed specifically for air-to-air combat. The Thunderchief could fight back. It had a 20mm cannon and could carry air-to-air missiles, but it was like asking a linebacker to box. Possible, but not what you'd built them for. The pilots called it going downtown, a piece of gallows humor for what was essentially flying into a mechanized hell designed specifically to destroy aircraft. Downtown meant Hanoi. Downtown meant the most heavily defended piece of airspace in the history of warfare, more dangerous than the skies over Berlin in 1944, more lethal than anything any pilot had ever faced. And the Thunderchiefs went anyway. Day after day. Mission after mission. They flew through curtains of flak so thick it looked like you could walk on it. They dodged telephone pole-sized missiles that left white contrails across the sky, missiles that could track you through evasive maneuvers, missiles that exploded in proximity with enough force to shred an aircraft that was half a mile away. They fought MiGs in aircraft designed for bombing, not dogfighting, pulling 6, 7, 8 Gs in turns that the thud wasn't really meant to make, hearing the airframe groan under stress that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. They dropped their ordnance with precision that astounded even their Soviet adversaries, putting bombs through windows of power plants, hitting the centers of bridges, destroying fuel depots with devastating accuracy. But the losses mounted. The thud was bleeding. By September 1967, the Air Force had lost over 200 F-105s in Southeast Asia. Republic had only built 833 of them total. The math was brutal and simple. At this rate, the supply of Thunderchiefs would run out before the war did. The North Vietnamese and their Soviet advisors knew the F-105 by sound before sight. That distinctive howl of the J-75 engine at full military power was different from the shriek of an F-4 Phantom or the whistle of a MiG-21. It was deeper, angrier, the sound of raw thrust forcing 50,000 pounds of metal through air that didn't want to move. The sound carried for miles in the clear morning air, a warning that the Americans were coming again, that another strike package was inbound, that air defenses had minutes to spin up and prepare. When that sound appeared on the horizon, air raid sirens wailed across Hanoi, and missile batteries swiveled toward the incoming threat. Soviet technicians manning the radar stations and missile control centers had been studying American aircraft for years, examining wreckage when they could get it, analyzing tactics from debriefs with North Vietnamese pilots, refining their countermeasures with each engagement. They'd seen F-4 Phantoms, beautiful and fast but fragile. They'd examined A-4 Skyhawks, compact and nimble but light. They'd even captured the occasional reconnaissance drone, studied its cameras and navigation systems. But the F-105 was different. It was the backbone of the American bombing effort, the aircraft that kept coming back no matter how many missiles they fired, no matter how many guns they trained skyward, no matter how perfectly they thought they'd predicted the American tactics. Soviet radar operators developed grudging respect for the American pilots who flew them. These weren't wild bomber jocks pressing attacks with more courage than sense. They were precision operators who understood their aircraft's capabilities down to the last hydraulic pump, who knew exactly how far they could push the thud before something broke, who flew with a combination of aggression and calculated risk that was difficult to counter. The Soviets knew when they hit one. The SA-2 missile had a proximity fuse that detonated when it sensed an aircraft nearby, sending thousands of steel fragments through the air in an expanding cloud of death. A solid hit would shred a MiG-21, would cripple an F-4. But they'd seen F-105s take hits that should have been fatal and keep flying. They'd watched aircraft trailing smoke and fuel continue their bombing runs, drop their ordnance, and turn south toward Thailand rather than bailing out over enemy territory. The pilots trusted their aircraft that much. When the missile struck that September day, the pilot never had a chance. The SA-2 detonated close enough to shred the tail section and sever multiple hydraulic lines in a single catastrophic instant. The F-105, which had been pulling out of a bombing run at 450 knots, suddenly lost control authority. The nose pitched up violently, the aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin, and despite the pilot's desperate attempts to recover, the thud fell from the sky like a stone. He ejected somewhere around 3,000 feet, his parachute blooming white against the monsoon clouds before he disappeared into the jungle below. He would spend the next 6 years in the notorious prison the Americans called the Hanoi Hilton, enduring interrogations and hardship, his name added to the long list of pilots shot down over North Vietnam. But his aircraft told a different story. His aircraft was about to become an intelligence treasure more valuable than any number of prisoner interrogations. Most combat losses resulted in wreckage so scattered and burned that useful intelligence was nearly impossible to extract. An aircraft hitting the ground at high speed disintegrates, components mixing with earth and vegetation until it's hard to tell what was airframe and what was impact crater. But this F-105 had come down in a spin, not a dive, its momentum dissipating as it spiraled rather than accelerating straight down. It had crashed into soft rice paddy soil that absorbed the impact like a cushion. The fuselage had broken apart, certainly, but major systems remained recognizable, intact enough to study. The wings, though crumpled, were structurally complete. The cockpit, though shattered, still showed its instrumentation layout. And most importantly, the internal weapons bay and avionics compartment had survived the crash with enough integrity that Soviet engineers could study them in detail. This was unprecedented. This was exactly what Soviet aviation intelligence had been hoping for since the war began. A nearly intact Thunderchief, the aircraft that had been a mystery despite being the primary American strike platform, sitting in North Vietnamese territory where they could examine it at leisure without American recovery teams interfering. The truck convoy that arrived the next morning carried more than just curious observers. These were the Soviet Union's best aviation engineers, radar specialists, weapons analysts, and materials scientists, men who had designed MiG interceptors and S-2 missile systems, who understood the theoretical limits of jet aircraft performance, who had spent their careers trying to match American technology with Soviet resources. Some had worked at the legendary Mikoyan Design Bureau. Others came from research institutes in Moscow and Leningrad. All of them had studied American aviation from a distance for years, analyzing photographs from reconnaissance missions, reading translated technical manuals obtained through intelligence operations, interviewing North Vietnamese pilots who'd encountered American aircraft in combat. Now, for the first time, they would get to examine one of America's frontline strike aircraft from the inside out. They would get to measure, photograph, document, and analyze without constraint. They brought calipers and micrometers, cameras with macro lenses for detail shots, tools for removing panels and accessing internal systems. They brought notebooks to sketch configurations and record observations. They brought an eagerness born of professional curiosity and national competition. This was their chance to see what the Americans had built, to understand the engineering that supported the most technologically advanced air force in the world. What they found stopped them cold. The first shock was simply the scale of everything. Soviet aircraft of the era, the MiG-21, the Su-7, the Yak-28, were built on a philosophy of simplicity and mass production. They were nimble, relatively light, designed to be maintained by conscript mechanics in austere field conditions with minimal tools. Soviet doctrine assumed that in any future war, aircraft would be lost by the hundreds, so they needed to be cheap enough to build in vast quantities and simple enough that replacement pilots with minimal training could fly them effectively. Performance mattered, but so did producibility. The F-105 was the opposite of that philosophy in almost every conceivable way. It was massive, complex, built with tolerances and materials that suggested an almost unlimited manufacturing budget. The engineers stood around the wreckage that first day, just taking in the scale of the thing. Even broken and scattered across a rice paddy, it was imposing. The engine intake alone was wide enough to walk into. The wing root was as thick as a man's torso. The landing gear struts were heavy enough to support small cars. One Soviet engineer, Colonel Vladimir Ilyin, whose notes were declassified decades later from military archives in Moscow, described approaching the wreckage with the assumption that he already understood American design philosophy. "We thought we knew what to expect," he wrote in his initial report. "We had examined American aircraft before. The F-4, the A-4, even captured examples from earlier conflicts. We understood that the Americans built their aircraft with more sophisticated systems, better materials, more powerful engines. But we believed these were evolutionary advances, not revolutionary ones. We were wrong from the first panel we removed. The hydraulic system alone was a revelation that rewrote Soviet understanding of American design priorities. Soviet aircraft typically used a single hydraulic system, maybe doubled in critical areas for redundancy on more advanced models. Even the MiG-21, their premier interceptor, had only basic redundancy. If the primary system failed, you had a backup, but it required the pilot to switch over manually and you accepted reduced control authority. The F-105 had 3 completely independent hydraulic systems, each capable of maintaining full flight control if the others failed. 3 separate pumps, driven by the engine. 3 completely separate sets of lines running through the airframe. 3 independent reservoirs of hydraulic fluid. And the crucial detail that stunned the Soviet engineers: the systems were routed through different sections of the fuselage, separated by structural bulkheads and armor plates, positioned so that a single hit couldn't disable multiple systems simultaneously. They traced the lines through the wreckage with growing amazement, noting how they were color-coded for identification, how they ran through reinforced channels, how the connections used quick disconnect fittings that would allow field maintenance crews to replace damaged sections in minutes rather than hours. It was engineering that assumed catastrophic damage and designed around it. It was engineering that said pilot survival and mission completion mattered more than weight savings or manufacturing simplicity. The titanium armor bathtub surrounding the cockpit was another shock to their understanding. Soviet fighters used armor sparingly, adding weight only where absolutely necessary and only in the most critical areas. A MiG-21 might have a small armor plate protecting the pilot from frontal attack, but it was aluminum or light steel, a compromise between protection and performance. The Thunderchief's pilot sat in what was essentially a flying tank. The Soviet engineers measured the titanium plates with calipers, their instruments confirming what their eyes could hardly believe. 3/4 of an inch thick on the bottom, 1/2 inch plates on the sides. All titanium, not steel, titanium, which was notoriously difficult to work with, expensive to refine, a material that the Soviet Union produced only in limited quantities for their most critical applications like submarine hulls and spacecraft. The Americans had used it lavishly, welding it into a protective shell that surrounded the entire cockpit area. One technician calculated the weight of the armor alone and realized it probably exceeded the entire empty weight of a MiG-21. The Americans had accepted that penalty willingly, had designed the rest of the aircraft to accommodate it, had built an engine powerful enough to push it all at supersonic speeds. The priorities were clear: bring the pilot home, even if it meant sacrificing some performance. But it was the avionics and weapons systems that truly astonished them, that forced them to confront how far ahead American electronics and systems integration had progressed. The internal weapons bay, designed originally for nuclear weapons, revealed a modular approach to payload configuration that Soviet aircraft simply didn't have. Soviet strike aircraft carried weapons on external pylons, fixed hardpoints that limited what you could hang from them. If you wanted to change mission types, it was a major reconfiguration. The F-105's internal bay used standardized mounting rails with quick-release mechanisms. Bombs, fuel tanks, electronic countermeasure pods, reconnaissance packages, everything could be swapped quickly using the same mounting points. The bay doors were electrically actuated, could be opened and closed from the cockpit with a switch. The whole system was designed for rapid turnaround, for an aircraft that might fly 3 missions in a single day with different payloads for each one. The wiring harnesses were color-coded and labeled, bundles of cables running through the fuselage with clear routing and identification. Soviet aircraft had wiring, obviously, but it was often a rat's nest of connections that required experienced technicians and circuit diagrams to troubleshoot. The F-105 systems were designed for rapid field maintenance by crews who might be working at night under combat conditions, who needed to be able to identify and replace damaged components quickly. The electronic countermeasure suite was particularly sophisticated, revealing capabilities the Soviets had suspected but never confirmed. The Americans had been jamming Soviet radar for years, but seeing the equipment integrated directly into the airframe systems was something else entirely. Radar warning receivers that could identify the type and direction of threatening radars. Jamming pods that could disrupt missile guidance systems. Chaff dispensers that could create false radar returns. All of it coordinated through a central system that gave the pilot real-time threat information displayed on cockpit instruments. It was a level of systems integration that Soviet aviation wouldn't achieve for another decade. Their aircraft had individual pieces of equipment, a radar warning receiver here, a chaff dispenser there, but they weren't integrated into a comprehensive defensive suite. The pilot had to manage multiple separate systems, interpret different warning signals, decide manually when to deploy countermeasures. The F-105 did much of this automatically. The systems talked to each other, prioritized threats, suggested responses to the pilot. It was closer to how Soviet engineers thought about fighter aircraft in the 1980s than the 1960s. Days turned into weeks as the examination continued, each day revealing new layers of sophisticated engineering. Every panel they removed, every system they traced, every component they analyzed added to their growing understanding and their growing concern. The engine, even damaged, showed manufacturing precision that Soviet metallurgists struggled to match. The turbine blades were single-crystal alloys, grown rather than cast, with heat-resistant coatings that allowed sustained supersonic flight without degradation. Soviet engines had shorter lifespans, required more frequent maintenance, couldn't sustain maximum power for as long. The fuel system used computer-controlled pumps that automatically managed center of gravity as fuel was consumed, keeping the aircraft balanced without pilot input. Soviet pilots had to manually manage fuel distribution using a series of valves and switches, a workload burden that American pilots didn't have to deal with. The electrical system had multiple redundant generators, automatic load balancing, circuit breakers that could be reset from the cockpit rather than requiring landing and physical access to the electrical bay. The oxygen supply system had backup bottles, automatic pressure regulation, warning systems that would alert the pilot to leaks or failures long before they became critical. The ejection seat was another revelation, a zero-zero capable system that could safely extract the pilot even at ground level and zero airspeed. Soviet ejection seats of the era required forward airspeed to work reliably. If you were hit on takeoff or during landing, your chances of successful ejection were poor. American pilots could eject safely from the runway if necessary. Everything was built to military specifications that seemed almost impossibly expensive. The fasteners were stainless steel or titanium, not mild steel. The control surfaces had sealed bearings. The hydraulic lines were reinforced with steel braid. The electrical connections were gold-plated to prevent corrosion. In a Soviet aircraft, these would be considered luxuries, unnecessary expenses that added weight and cost without proportional performance benefit. But the Americans had built them in any way because they understood something about sustained combat operations. Reliability matters as much as performance. An aircraft that breaks down from corrosion or where isn't flying missions, isn't delivering ordnance, isn't helping win the war. Build it right the first time, even if it costs more, and it'll keep fighting longer. One evening, after a particularly long day of documentation, a senior Soviet engineer sat in a canvas chair outside the examination facility, smoking a cigarette and staring at the disassembled wreckage spread across the warehouse floor. A colleague asked him what he thought, whether they could build something equivalent. His answer would be quoted in internal Soviet aviation reports for years afterward, becoming almost legendary within their aerospace community. This aircraft was built for punishment. It fights like a machine that knows it will be hit and survive. We can copy components. We can measure dimensions. We can analyze materials. But we cannot copy the philosophy behind it, the assumption that every pilot matters enough to surround with fortress walls, that every system matters enough to triple its redundancy. That requires resources and a design mentality we do not have. The implications rippled through Soviet military aviation circles like a seismic shock. The engineers compiled their reports over 6 weeks of intensive examination, included hundreds of photographs, detailed technical drawings of every system they could analyze, material samples they'd collected for metallurgical study. The documents made their way to Moscow in diplomatic pouches, marked with the highest security classifications, distributed to the design bureaus responsible for the next generation of Soviet strike aircraft. The message was clear and deeply uncomfortable. The Americans weren't just ahead in individual technologies. They had embraced an entirely different design philosophy, one that Soviet aviation had difficulty replicating not because of technical limitations but because of fundamental differences in doctrine and resources. Soviet aircraft were built to avoid damage through speed and maneuverability, to overwhelm defenses through numbers, to accept losses as a necessary cost of warfare. American aircraft, at least the F-105 and presumably others, were built to absorb damage and keep fighting, to bring pilots home, to prioritize survivability even when it meant sacrificing some performance or accepting higher unit costs. It was the difference between a rapier and a broadsword, between finesse and overwhelming force, between accepting attrition and fighting to minimize it. Both approaches could work, but they reflected vastly different assumptions about the value of individual pilots, the availability of replacement aircraft, the importance of maintaining experienced aircrew. Soviet designers began incorporating lessons from the F-105 into their own projects, though implementing those lessons was complicated by resource constraints and doctrinal resistance. The Su-24 bomber, which entered service in the 1970s, showed clear influences: redundant flight control systems, armored cockpit sections, modular weapons bays. It was the first Soviet strike aircraft designed from the beginning with survivability as a primary consideration rather than an afterthought. The Su-25 ground attack aircraft took the concept even further, becoming the Soviet equivalent of the 8-10 Warthog, an aircraft designed from the beginning to operate in intense anti-aircraft environments and survive. It had redundant systems, armor protection, Simple but robust construction. Soviet pilots called it the flying tank, the same nickname American pilots had given the P-47 Thunderbolt decades earlier. The lineage was clear. But reverse engineering philosophy was harder than reverse engineering hardware. The F-105 represented an American approach to warfare that the Soviets found difficult to fully replicate. The assumption that their pilots were valuable enough to surround with titanium armor, that their aircraft were worth building 3 backup systems into, that survivability mattered as much as raw performance. Soviet doctrines still emphasized quantity over quality, acceptable losses over individual preservation. They could build tougher aircraft, but they couldn't fundamentally change the industrial and military system that prioritized production numbers over unit capability. Meanwhile, back over the skies of North Vietnam, the F-105s kept coming. Despite losses that would ground lesser aircraft types, despite missions that had survival odds a Las Vegas bookie wouldn't touch, despite the growing sophistication of North Vietnamese air defenses, the Thuds flew on. Month after month, year after year, they hammered targets around Hanoi, tested their luck against missiles and MiGs, brought their pilots home through skill and stubborn engineering. Pilots who survived their tours, 100 missions over North Vietnam, each won a roll of the dice, told stories that sounded like fiction until you saw the gun camera footage and damage reports. Aircraft returning to base with holes you could crawl through, with entire tail sections shredded by shrapnel, with hydraulic fluids spraying into the cockpit and engines running on fumes. Aircraft that had taken direct hits from 37mm anti-aircraft shells and kept flying, that had been clipped by missile explosions and made it home, that had fought off MiGs and completed their bombing runs with battle damage that should have been fatal. And yet they landed. They taxied to their revetments. They were swarmed by maintenance crews working through the night, patching holes with aluminum plates, replacing shot-out hydraulic lines, swapping damaged control surfaces. And the next morning, they flew again. The same pilots, the same aircraft, back into the same hostile skies. The Soviet technicians in Hanoi saw those damaged aircraft return too, through reconnaissance photographs and pilot debriefs. They knew the F-105s they'd damaged, missiles that had detonated close enough to be kill shots, were somehow making it home. The wreckage they'd examined explained how. Every redundant system, every armor plate, every over-engineered component, it all made sense in the context of sustained combat operations in the most hostile airspace ever created. One Soviet report, compiled in late 1967 after multiple F-105 examinations, they would capture and study several more before the war ended, included a frank assessment that was remarkable for its candor, especially coming from a military culture not known for admitting inferiority. The American F-105 represents a level of engineering sophistication and manufacturing precision that exceeds our current capabilities. Its design philosophy prioritizes pilot survival and mission completion over cost efficiency and ease of production. We cannot match this aircraft pound for pound with existing technology. Attempts to directly counter it through improved air defenses have been only partially successful. Our best response is to study its design principles and incorporate applicable lessons into future Soviet aircraft development, while acknowledging that full replication would require fundamental changes to our aviation industry and doctrine. It was a rare admission from an adversary, buried in classified files that wouldn't be seen outside Soviet military circles for decades. But it spoke to something the American pilots already knew. The Thud might not be pretty, might not be agile, might not be anyone's idea of a glamorous fighter. But it was tough. It was reliable. It was survivable. And when the mission demanded flying into hell itself, it was the aircraft you wanted beneath you. The human dimension of the F-105 story is inseparable from its technical achievements, because machines don't fly themselves and engineering excellence means nothing without people willing to push it to its limits. These weren't test pilots flying experimental aircraft in controlled conditions, carefully exploring flight envelopes with chase planes and emergency crews standing by. These were combat pilots, many barely in their 20s, fresh from training programs that couldn't really prepare them for what they'd face, flying 100 mission tours through airspace so deadly that survival odds decreased with mathematical certainty with every sortie north. They lived in barracks at bases in Thailand, Korat, Takli, Udorn, tropical bases carved from jungle, surrounded by rice paddies and villages where water buffalo grazed near the runway perimeter. They played cards between missions, wrote letters home that couldn't describe what they'd seen because the sensors would black it out anyway, tried to sleep through heat and humidity that made the metal barracks feel like ovens even at night. They were Air Force officers, professionals trained in the technical demands of operating sophisticated aircraft, but they were also young men processing the reality that every morning might be their last. They developed superstitions the way combat pilots always do, rituals that gave them the illusion of control over circumstances fundamentally beyond control. Lucky scarves worn on every mission. Specific pre-flight routines that couldn't be varied even slightly. Lucky numbers painted on the aircraft nose. Call signs that became identities more real than their given names. Some refused to fly Mission 13 or Mission 77. Others insisted on the same crew chief, the same aircraft if possible, the same seat in the formation. And they developed absolute trust in the thud. This was perhaps the most important psychological element of survival, the belief that your aircraft would do what you asked it to, that it would take the punishment and keep flying, that the engineers had built in enough safety margins and redundancy that even when things went catastrophically wrong, you still had a chance. When you're flying at 500 feet through a valley, with a MiG on your tail and missile warnings screaming in your headset, with tracer fire arcing up from the hillsides and your wingman calling out threats you haven't seen yet, you need to believe. You need to know that when you pull back on that stick and light the afterburner, the aircraft will respond, will give you everything it has, will fight as hard to survive as you are. The F-105 earned that trust mission after mission, bringing pilots home who by all rights should have died. The statistics are almost incomprehensible when you really think about them. The Thunderchief had the lowest loss rate per mission of any American aircraft in the early years of Rolling Thunder, despite flying the most dangerous missions against the most heavily defended targets. It was shot at more, hit more, pushed harder, and yet a higher percentage of pilots survived. Stories spread through the squadrons like legends, passed from experienced pilots to new arrivals, told over beers at the officers' club with the kind of reverence reserved for miracles. Major Leo Thorsness, who would earn the Medal of Honor for a mission in April 1967 where he fought off MiGs, destroyed surface-to-air missile sites, and provided cover for a downed pilot, all while low on fuel and ammunition, his aircraft taking hits that should have ended the mission. He kept fighting because the thud kept flying, because every system he needed kept working despite battle damage that would have crippled lesser aircraft. Captain Merlin Dethlefsen, who continued his bombing run despite taking multiple hits from anti-aircraft fire, his aircraft's systems failing around him one by one, because his wingman needed cover and the mission demanded completion. He put his bombs on target, fought his way back to Thailand with an aircraft that was barely controllable, and landed successfully. He would also receive the Medal of Honor. The citation mentioned his courage, his dedication, his refusal to abandon the mission. But pilots who read it understood the subtext. He trusted his aircraft enough to keep pushing when every instinct said to bail out. These weren't propaganda stories invented in Washington to boost morale or sell war bonds. These were real missions, documented in after-action reports, verified by gun camera footage and wingman testimony, written up in dry military language that couldn't quite capture the chaos and terror and split-second decisions that separated survival from death. The Air Force had detailed records of every mission, every hit taken, every system failure, every emergency landing. The F-105's performance under fire wasn't marketing, it was statistical fact. The maintenance crews who kept the thuds flying were their own kind of heroes, though they never got medals or had their names in newspapers. They worked through tropical heat that made metal too hot to touch with bare hands, through monsoon rains that flooded the flight line and turned everything to mud, through 18-hour shifts when the operational tempo demanded it. They patched battle damage that would have totaled civilian aircraft, replaced shot-out hydraulic lines and shredded control surfaces on timelines that seemed impossible, performed structural repairs that should have required factory facilities using improvised tools and pure determination. They took pride in their aircraft in ways that ground crews always do, but with an added intensity born of knowing their work directly determined whether pilots lived or died. They painted nose art and mission tallies, gave their aircraft names, talked to them like living things while they worked. They mourned when one didn't come back, felt it personally when the aircraft they'd maintained and cared for was shot down over North Vietnam. And they felt vindicated, triumphant even, when an aircraft they'd patched together from what looked like scrap metal flew another mission and came home again. They understood what the Soviet engineers in Hanoi understood. The F-105 was a machine built to be maintained under fire, designed around the assumption that it would come home damaged and needed to be fixed quickly and returned to combat. The modular systems, the quick disconnect fittings, the color-coded wiring, the standardized components, all of it made their jobs possible. A good crew chief could replace a shot-out hydraulic line in 30 minutes. A damaged wing panel could be swapped in an hour. Engine changes that took days on other aircraft could be done overnight on the Thud. By 1968, the F-105 had flown more missions over North Vietnam than any other American aircraft. It had dropped more ordnance, faced more surface-to-air missiles, engaged more MiGs, absorbed more battle damage. It had also suffered more losses. 382 Thunderchiefs were lost in Southeast Asia by the war's end, more than half the total production run. But those numbers only tell part of the story, the part that's easy to quantify in statistical reports and loss analyses. How many missions succeeded because the F-105 could take damage that would down other aircraft? How many pilots survived because they were sitting in a titanium bathtub instead of an aluminum cockpit? How many makeshift repairs held together long enough to cross back into friendly territory, giving the pilot a chance to eject over areas where rescue helicopters could reach them? How many times did those triple hydraulic systems keep an aircraft controllable when any lesser redundancy would have resulted in an unrecoverable spin? The Soviet technicians who examined that wreckage in September 1967 never flew the missions. They never felt the stick shake as a missile passed close enough to ring the airframe like a bell. They never experienced the peculiar relief of touching down with warning lights flashing across the panel, hydraulic fluid spraying, one engine running rough, knowing you'd survived another day because your aircraft had absorbed punishment that should have been lethal. They never pulled 6 Gs in a defensive brake, feeling the aircraft groan under stress, trusting that Republic's engineers had built in enough safety margin that you could ask this much of the airframe. But they understood, on an intellectual level at least, what American engineering had achieved. They could measure the armor thickness, trace the redundant systems, analyze the materials and manufacturing techniques. They could compile reports that explained, in technical language, why the F-105 was so difficult to shoot down, why it kept coming back, why American pilots trusted it with their lives. What they couldn't measure, couldn't quantify in their reports, was the intangible quality that came from knowing someone had designed this aircraft with the explicit intention of bringing you home. That knowledge changed how pilots flew, how aggressively they pressed attacks, how much risk they were willing to accept. As the war ground toward its inconclusive end, as political decisions in Washington gradually reduced the intensity of the bombing campaign, the F-105's role began to diminish. Newer aircraft like the F-4 Phantom took over more strike missions. The F-111, which was supposed to replace the Thunderchief, finally became operational despite years of development problems. By 1970, most of the conventional bombing F-105s had been withdrawn from combat operations in Southeast Asia, their mission complete or at least no longer required. But the Wild Weasel variant of the Thunderchief, specialized for hunting and destroying surface-to-air missile sites, continued flying, and would continue for decades more. The Wild Weasels were modified F-105s with additional electronic warfare equipment, designed to deliberately provoke enemy radar into tracking them so they could locate and destroy the sites with anti-radiation missiles. It was perhaps the most dangerous mission in modern warfare, flying directly into the teeth of air defenses, making yourself a target, trusting your aircraft and your electronic countermeasures to keep you alive long enough to shoot back. The F-105G Wild Weasel would serve until 1984, nearly 3 decades after the first F-105 prototype flew. That kind of longevity was remarkable for any aircraft, unprecedented for one designed in the early 1950s with slide rules and wind tunnel models rather than computers. The airframe, the basic engineering, the fundamental design philosophy, all of it proved robust enough to remain relevant through multiple generations of technological advancement. When the last F-105s were retired from active duty, Air Force bases held retirement ceremonies with full military honors. Veterans gathered to share stories, their ranks thinning each year as age and time did what North Vietnamese air defenses couldn't. Maintenance crews posed for photographs beside aircraft they'd kept flying through impossible circumstances, their faces showing pride mixed with something like grief at seeing these machines finally grounded. Pilots who'd flown hundreds of missions stood silently beside the aircraft that had brought them home, hands touching the metal skin one last time, remembering mornings when they'd walked to this same aircraft knowing they might not come back. And quietly, in military archives and intelligence agencies, Soviet reports about captured Thunderchiefs were being declassified as the Cold War wound down, revealing for the first time just how much respect the enemy had held for this ungainly, brutal, magnificent machine. American aviation historians reading these reports decades later would find detailed technical drawings, thoughtful analyses, frank assessments of American engineering superiority, and that remarkable admission that they'd never seen engineering like it. The lessons the Soviets learned from the F-105 influenced their aviation for a generation, visible in the designs that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. But the lessons American aviation learned were even more profound, more lasting, more fundamental to how the United States would design combat aircraft for the next 50 years. The Thunderchief had proven that survivability was as important as performance, that protecting the pilot was worth the weight and complexity, that systems redundancy wasn't excess engineering, it was necessity in modern combat. These weren't abstract principles debated in design meetings. They were proven facts, written in the survival statistics of pilots who'd flown through the most hostile airspace in history and lived to tell about it. When McDonnell Douglas designed the F-15 Eagle in the 1970s, they built in triple redundant flight control systems, armored cockpits, redundant electrical systems. When General Dynamics designed the F-16 Fighting Falcon, they incorporated lessons about pilot survivability and systems redundancy even in a lightweight fighter. When Fairchild Republic, successor to the company that built the Thunderchief, designed the 810 Warthog, they created an aircraft that was essentially a flying tank, armored and redundant and built to take punishment and keep fighting. The philosophy that built the Thud, designed for the worst-case scenario, planned for damage, bring the pilot home, became doctrine, enshrined in Air Force requirements documents and design specifications. Modern American combat aircraft are expected to survive battle damage, to have redundant systems, to protect the pilot above almost all other considerations. It's so fundamental to how we think about military aviation that it's easy to forget it wasn't always this way, that it had to be learned through hard experience over the skies of North Vietnam. In museum hangars today, surviving F-105s sit silent and still, their polished aluminum skin reflecting light off curves and angles that once screamed through hostile skies at supersonic speeds. Visitors walk past, reading placards about speed and payload, about missions flown and targets destroyed, about the pilots who flew them and the crews who maintained them. Children press their faces against the ropes, staring up at the massive fuselage and swept wings, trying to imagine what it was like when this machine was young and dangerous and alive. But the real story isn't on the placard, isn't captured in the static display or the technical specifications listed beside the aircraft. It's in the triple hydraulic lines running through the airframe, carefully routed through separate channels so a single hit couldn't disable them all. It's in the titanium plates surrounding the cockpit, thick enough to stop cannon rounds, heavy enough to require a more powerful engine just to lift them into the air. It's in every over-engineered, redundant, stubbornly survivable system that Soviet engineers examined in disbelief in 1967, measuring and photographing and trying to understand not just how it worked but why anyone would build it this way. They'd never seen engineering like it because it represented something beyond technical capability, beyond materials science or aerodynamic refinement or manufacturing precision. It represented a commitment to bringing people home. It represented American industrial might applied not to building the fastest or the prettiest or the cheapest, but to building something that could absorb hell itself and keep flying. It represented a philosophy that said every pilot mattered enough to surround with a fortress, that every mission mattered enough to demand the best engineering human knowledge could provide, that survival wasn't a luxury or an afterthought but the primary design consideration. The Soviets could study the wreckage, measure the components, analyze the materials, copy the designs. They did all of these things, produced detailed technical reports, incorporated lessons into their own aircraft. But they couldn't fully copy the philosophy, couldn't replicate the industrial base and military culture that made the F-105 possible. Their aircraft got better, more survivable, more sophisticated. But they remained fundamentally different in their priorities, their assumptions about acceptable losses, their calculations of what a pilot's life was worth in engineering terms. The F-105 Thunderchief wasn't the most advanced aircraft of its era. The State Route 71 flew higher and faster. The F-4 Phantom was more versatile. The F-8 Crusader was more agile. By pure performance metrics, the Thunderchief wasn't the best at anything except perhaps raw payload capacity. But performance metrics don't capture everything that matters in combat. They don't measure courage or reliability or the trust between pilot and machine. They don't quantify the value of coming home. What the Thud had, what made Soviet engineers shake their heads in reluctant admiration, was toughness. Survivability. The ability to take damage that would destroy other aircraft and keep flying. In the brutal arithmetic of air combat over North Vietnam, where every mission was a calculated risk and the odds got worse with every sortie, that mattered more than anything else. Speed couldn't save you from a missile you never saw coming. Agility couldn't help when you flew through a box barrage of anti-aircraft fire. But armor could stop shrapnel. Redundant systems could keep you controllable after a hit. Strong engineering could give you a chance when tactics and luck ran out. The pilots who flew the F-105 understood this in ways that people who've never been shot at can't quite grasp. They weren't naive about their aircraft's limitations. They knew it was heavy, knew it was ungainly, knew that in a turning fight with a MiG-21 they were at a severe disadvantage. But they also knew that when they took hits, not if, but when, they had a better chance of survival than pilots flying other aircraft. That knowledge was worth more than speed or maneuverability. It was worth more than almost anything. Somewhere in a Vietnamese rice paddy, pieces of that first captured Thunderchief still rest beneath the soil, rusting slowly back into the earth. The aluminum skin has long since corroded away. The titanium armor, more resistant to decay, might survive another century before it too finally dissolves into component elements. The hydraulic lines have leaked their last drops of fluid. The wiring harnesses have degraded to nothing. The machine that Soviet engineers examined with such intense curiosity is gone, reclaimed by the jungle and the rain and time itself. The Soviet engineers who examined it are gone now too, their careers ended, their lives completed, their expertise passed to younger generations who learned from their reports and built better aircraft using lessons extracted from American wreckage. The reports themselves sit in archives, declassified now, available to historians and researchers who want to understand how the Cold War was fought through technical analysis as much as through missiles and diplomacy. The pilots who flew the F-105 are aging, their numbers diminishing with each passing year, They're stories of missions over Hanoi becoming historical artifacts rather than living memory. Squadron reunions get smaller. Fewer hands go up when someone asks who flew Thuds in Vietnam. The maintenance crews are aging too, the crew chiefs and mechanics who worked through tropical nights patching holes and replacing systems and sending aircraft back into combat at dawn. But the aircraft they flew, the machine that earned the grudging respect of its enemies and the absolute trust of its pilots, remains a testament to a moment when American engineering reached for something beyond performance specifications and payload calculations. It reached for survival, for resilience, for the simple, stubborn determination to build a machine that could take everything the enemy threw at it and still bring its pilot home. That Soviet engineer sitting outside the examination facility in September 1967, smoking his cigarette and staring at the disassembled wreckage spread across the warehouse floor, his words echo across decades, preserved in classified reports that became historical documents. This aircraft was built for punishment. It fights like a machine that knows it will be hit and survive. He was right. And in the end, that was the Thunderchief's greatest achievement. Not that it could fly fast or carry a heavy payload or reach Mach 2 in level flight, but that it could survive. That it could fight. That it could, against all odds and through the worst the enemy could deliver, bring its pilots home. Not always. 382 losses prove that nothing is invincible, that luck runs out, that even the best engineering has limits. But often enough. Consistently enough. Reliably enough that pilots trusted it with their lives and that trust was rewarded more often than not. They'd never seen engineering like it because there had never been engineering like it before. And in many ways, there hasn't been since. Modern aircraft are more capable, more sophisticated, packed with computers and sensors and weapons systems that would seem like science fiction to F-105 pilots. But strip away the technology, look at the fundamental philosophy, and you see the Thunderchief's influence in every redundant system, every armor plate, every design decision that prioritizes bringing the pilot home. The F-105 Thunderchief stands alone in aviation history, a brutal, beautiful, uncompromising machine built for the worst war in the worst skies at the worst possible time. And it didn't just survive. It prevailed. It proved that toughness matters, that survivability is a weapon in itself, that engineering excellence isn't measured only in speed or altitude or payload but in the number of pilots who walk away from missions that should have killed them. Soviet engineers examined the wreckage and admitted they'd never seen engineering like it. American pilots flew the missions and learned to trust it with their lives. And history remembers it as one of the most important combat aircraft of the Cold War, not because it was the best at everything, but because it was the best at the one thing that mattered most, bringing its people home.